Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. So I lead all our startup and investor engagement, including our startup programs for all of Europe for the Google Cloud organization. So what does that mean? It means that effectively we are working with startups across the continent and ultimately trying to help them make sense of a lot of the hype. So obviously nowadays everyone wants to talk about AI and machine learning. I always joke around that 3 years ago, every pitch deck that I reviewed said big data. Now they've all done a control find and replaced it with AI and ML. But it's all for good reason. And ultimately, through our startup programs, a lot of what we try and do is help teams make sense of it all, but also provide some enablement. Because building a startup is hard in and of itself. So we want to try and help companies that are thinking about how do we implement some machine learning into some of our capabilities and pieces of our product. So ultimately, we can help them figure out how do they kind of temper expectations and understand their use cases to try and make sure that they don't accelerate their burn rate too much. And then it's also, even with investors that we work with, trying to help them make sense of the various business models, because many of them are wondering, where's our money going to and how do we make sense of it all? So, from an entrepreneur standpoint, ultimately, we're helping them to kind of aggregate all those thoughts around machine learning and then put it to use. So I think first, it's good to talk about what's driving a lot of the things around machine learning. And it's actually just very basic fundamental principles that it's still all about the people, right? And machine learning revolution is causing this arms race to hire talent. If you think about, there's, when I last checked, I think something like 35 million professional coders in the world, but how many of those are, say, machine learning engineers? And then when you have that small subset, it means that people are starting to have some philosophical conversations around how do we do things around hiring. So you're starting to see a lot more decentralized hiring, which then, because ultimately people want to try and hire wherever the best talent is. But then that's causing people to think about, hey, how do we maintain our cultural kind of company culture and our identity as a company? So that's also actually helping to spawn a new generation of startups that are being born, trying to help companies solve that bit. So you have a lot of new companies that are using machine learning themselves to try and figure out how do they help companies to hire, how do they hire developers, but then also how do you retain the talent as well. There's a Danish company, Peakon, that does a wonderful job of kind of aggregating all the information that's being said within a company and then synthesizing those thoughts to then try and provide kind of predictive behavioral information for companies and organizations to ultimately figure out what programs and what things they should do to be able to retain talent. But then beyond that, anyone that's gotten investment and just in general, they'll always be asking about revenue. It's always one of the core things. So internally we talk quite a bit about the next billion users and how do you reach them. And for us, that has been part of the core fundamental shift to kind of a AI everything world for us. And then of course it's all about data. When we think of it and put it in the context of the world we live in, and we can talk about AI and ML all we want, but it's still fundamentally about the data. And that actually caused us to have some kind of fundamental conversations around, how are we going to service this new world when data is growing at exponential rates? So for us, it was fundamentally saying, right, we need to change how we do computing. So that's where we started treating our data centers as the computer. And then it also led us to build the largest software-defined network in the world. So, for us, that's tremendously important because it allows us to run things like YouTube, search, Gmail, maps at planet scale. So it's certainly been battle-tested, and it's allowed us to then put a lot of those learnings into actual machine learning. So, I mentioned earlier that we've shifted from kind of mobile first to AI everything. And ultimately, that meant that we started doing things like building our own hardware. So for us, we're actually one of the largest hardware manufacturers in the world, and we manufacture most of our own stuff, including the tensor processing unit, which is a custom ASIC. So when you think about kind of the growth that was happening across our own services that consumers use every day, we had calculated that if we continue growing at the same rate, then we were going to have to spend an insane amount of money. We're talking in the billions just to build out like something like 50 or 60 new data centers, and that just wasn't sustainable. So for us, it was also making that change around creating our own custom chips. So if anyone has watched AlphaGo that happened over the last couple years from DeepMind, those chips that were used were these. So we announced at Google I/O last May that we would be releasing them into the wild that people can consume through Google Cloud. We didn't provide a date, but without putting everyone under NDA, you'll just have to trust me that it'll be soon. But the power of those chips and what they've ultimately have done is just allowing us to become a lot more efficient in the computing for machine learning. If you think about kind of compute, GPUs have traditionally been used to train models, but GPUs weren't built specifically for machine learning or deep learning. They were built for gaming. And a lot of people, that's a bit of a misconception that they always think that GPUs will always be faster and cheaper versus CPUs. Not true. But that did lead us down the path of wanting to build our own chips that are specific for neural nets. So that's been tremendously helpful. That said, I do want to throw some caution for a lot of people that are starting to think about entering this whole machine learning world. And it's make sure that ultimately you understand your use case, because we have time and time again many startups that say, I'm going all in, we're going to hire a bunch of PhDs, and all of a sudden it drives up their burn rate, and then it actually leads to unhappiness because the people they hired feel that they're not actually doing what they were brought on to do. So make sure that you understand your use case, and there's a lot of pre-trained models, off-the-shelf services that people can use. I'll walk through in a bit several that exist out there. But invariably, sometimes people may hit that fork in the road where they may have to train their own models. They may be just doing some really bespoke things. So then the two questions that I always get are, where do you hire these people, and how do you get access to data sets? So there's a variety of ways to go about it, from crowdsourcing to things like the Open Data Institute by Tim Berners-Lee, to then Kaggle. Kaggle is a data science marketplace where people are consistently posting data sets, and people are also running competitions. So I always say, if you're looking to hire, it's a great place to try and go about it. Post a competition, and people that can help you solve it, try and go after them and hire them. Now, full transparency, we did acquire Kaggle almost a year ago, last March. But that was certainly with intent to try and continue our mission of democratizing AI and making more data sets available. Now, kind of going back to your pre-trained models and kind of what are off-the-shelf items that people can use. Vision API, certainly one of the more famous ones. So this is, for us, what powers Google Photos. So it's your classic OCR image recognition where you can assign tags and classifications. And in doing so, then you can set your probabilities of what's acceptable. So use case that I wanted to show now is a Berlin-based startup, Nairis. And I don't know if the video will work, but effectively what it would show is taking a picture, and then it catalogs it against what's in stock for the company. So they have some good partners like Target, Daimler Chrysler, where for Daimler Chrysler, they can take a picture of a fleet of vehicles, and then they can actually say which ones should go in for inspection and whatnot. So pretty cool stuff of how they're going about doing that. And another kind of pre-trained model API is natural language. So natural language has long been Google's core. If you think about the early days, we kind of invented a very clever hack called information retrieval, made it feel like it was AI, but it wasn't. And then we kind of progressed from there to web search and web answers, and then ultimately to knowledge graphs. And that's where you get into natural language. And this is great for people that are looking to ultimately do sentiment analysis and try and understand what are people saying about them and their products. So you see a lot of people that use this quite a bit, just so they can be that much smarter in how they make decisions around their products. Then beyond that, voice and speech recognition is increasing and going beyond your traditional sectors of, say, like the finance sector, in trading, where we've seen it. But then a lot of companies that maybe they have customer support centers where they'll use it so that way they can better train their employees to improve the overall quality of service that they're delivering. And then translation API, that's been around that may be the longest running API that we've had. But we've gave it a massive update about a year ago. And yeah, it's supporting, actually this slide's outdated now, over 100 languages. I believe it's closer to 150 now. And then the video intelligence API. So this is where ultimately you play videos, and frame by frame, it can identify what's in the frame. And then you can make it searchable, and you can add tags and classifications. So quite useful. There's actually a startup based in Finland called Velosa that has built something similar. And to be honest, I think it's even more advanced than what we've built. So you should check them out. They're really cool. So we've made it quite easy for people to be able to try these for free. Literally, you can drag and drop pictures in there to see the image recognition, which is nice. And then same by clicking on buttons to do speech recognition. So that's pretty cool that we've made that easy. Kind of jumping ahead. So kind of talked about the pre-trained models and that they exist. But if you do need to go and build some more bespoke kind of training, then ultimately you have a few different options, or a couple different options rather. So effectively with machine learning, you have a lot of complex maths, and then you have to build the back-end infrastructure, and then you got to figure out how to make them meet. And that's a very challenging thing to do. So we've made that a bit easier by creating a managed machine learning service called ML Engine. And effectively, you drop in your models, it'll do the learning for you. And it has some cool built-in things like hyper-tuning, which is really cool, because if you make a change, then you have to wait to see what's the knock-on impact of making that change. And depending on how much data you're talking about, that could be anywhere from, say, minutes to hours to days, depending on what you're doing. So with built-in hyper-tuning, that can help to shorten that process a bit, which is nice. And then, of course, if you have to kind of do some more bespoke things, then you can just fire up compute instances and attach GPUs if you need to, or soon TPUs as well. So we focused a lot on just kind of what are some of the things that exist that are kind of off the shelf, and kind of what options that you have if you need to do things that are bespoke. But at the end of the day, it's still fundamentally about the data. It's where most people spend the majority of their time. So if you think about it, most time is spent in the data pre-processing, creating the data pipelines and data cleanup. So if that's where people spend the majority of their time, then you have to also kind of subscribe to the idea and the notion of kind of garbage in, garbage out when it comes to the data. So I urge anyone that's thinking about kind of adding machine learning capabilities to their teams to think about that piece of making sure that the team that they hire around that is very strong, because that's where ultimately they'll probably spend, or you will spend most of your time. And kind of going on with that data piece, it's, even for a cucumber farm in Japan, Ultimately, it took about 7,000 pictures. But after 7,000 pictures, all of a sudden they had accuracy to be able to see whether the quality for the cucumber was ready to be shipped. So that's really cool because that was actually kind of like you had the prodigal son that came back from university, and he just thought, well, there must be a better way because family had always said nothing trumps quality, but it was always by hand. So he actually got a Raspberry Pi, hooked up a camera to it, and then he used a TensorFlow model. And those not familiar with TensorFlow, it's a machine learning framework that Google open sourced and created. And then all of a sudden, there you go. And also kind of going with the whole data theme is, in this case, it was 10 terabytes of data. But ultimately, it was what allowed them to try and figure out how to help protect from illegal fisheries. So pretty cool how they were able to do that. And there's a really cool AI startup. This one's Merantix, based in Berlin, and they effectively work on like 3 main projects: high-frequency trading, safety for autonomous vehicles, and then also early cancer detection for mammography screenings. So that's the one I'm going to focus on, and just kind of highlight. But it goes without saying that obviously the percentages are stacked against you without early detection, and ultimately they are going through and scanning several different images, and through that process, they're able to then detect anomalies and also be able to kind of detect, where, or rather predict where they think are some areas that maybe are suspect. So it's really a great example of a company that is kind of putting machine learning to work, feeding it with data. That they were able to strike a nice partnership with some corporates to be able to get that data. So well done by them, and ultimately what it's allowing them to do. And the last use case that I wanted to provide is a company called Ravlin. So this startup, they are helping to prevent credit card fraud detection through machine learning. So I'm going to play a video where we'll get to hear the CTO and co-founder, Lenny, talk about it. So let's see if they can get the video going. Oh, okay. I'm being told no video. So that's fine. But effectively, it was going to show that they kind of use network graph analysis to be able to determine patterns of uses and behaviors with credit cards. And ultimately, what it's allowed them to do is be able to catch crime rings and syndicates. And their like kind of big achievement was that they actually brought down a whole crime syndicate. And the visual is pretty extraordinary when you see how many connected credit cards there were to single individuals. It's pretty astounding. So if anyone ever wants to see the video, I'm happy to email it because it's pretty cool. And kind of just to kind of wrap things up, what I would say is ultimately anyone that is thinking about building or injecting AI into their products, I would say that make sure that people are doing it for the right reasons, not because people want to raise some crazy valuation or not because they want to have some acqui-hire. Do it because you want to change humanity, you want to create new behaviors or create new categories. Because invariably, those that choose to do it for the other reasons I said, we've just seen time and time again that it doesn't end up a good proposition for them. So do it for the right reasons. And happy to take questions. Thanks.
Yeah, look, I'm already coming. Sorry about being late. Let's have some questions as well. You definitely have some questions. Baltic audience, look, I see 2 hands like really, like very well up there. Where is the catch box? And throw it like, yeah, somebody else is going to be hit. Yeah.
You said something about the movie AlphaGo. I presume that you saw that movie.
I didn't hear what you said.
AlphaGo, the movie.
Oh, yeah.
So I presume that you saw the movie. Did you saw those moments when those guys saw that DeepMind did some moves that they actually didn't know what the DeepMind is doing? And how do you think about this whole machine learning thing? How much do we understand? Or are we just poking somewhere and, oh, let's see what's going on here? What will be a result?
Yeah, so I think of it from the perspective of the conversation and topic around AI has been happening since the 50s. The only difference is now that computing power has caught up. So I think in some respects it's not new, but in others it is new. So I think, from what you're asking, that there's still a lot of unknowns. So I think people are kind of trying to unpack AI, if you will, into kind of small pieces that we can kind of consume for our own learning. Because I think our own human capacity only has so much, and we're trying to identify where are the use cases and where can it help to improve lives. So I think people are kind of starting with that notion of how can we do something that can help improve lives or create efficiencies. And people like us, we're trying to democratize the landscape for people to use AI. I mean, most of what we provide from a cloud perspective is a lot of general purpose APIs, and then what we see is people just layering on top their own services. So you're seeing some wonderful businesses being created from that.
There was another question there?
Yes, another question. What do you think about the following? So I can take some data, ship to your API, get some labels, and build my model over those labels, and don't pay for the API anymore. This is actually a well-known practice, to get some initial labels for data. Do you have any protection for this or any ideas how to deal with such cases?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I mean, I can use your services to get some labels for my data, but I don't have any model. But after that, I can build my model over those labels, like copy your part of API, and don't use your API anymore. I mean, machine learning API. And do you have any protection for this or any idea how to treat this?
I mean, at the end of the day, it's your data, it's not ours.
No, I mean, I'm talking not about data, but like copying your model. I mean, if I have labels on my data, I can build my model and don't pay any money for machine learning API.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the benefits of TensorFlow being open source, is that you see people kind of taking and shifting things however they see fit. So, I think that what you're describing, it's certainly possible, because I see it happen all the time.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. There was another question there by Kaspars.
Yeah, I wanted to ask the first question all over again, because I remember I had a passing interest in whether or not, I think it was European legislation, whether it was already accepted or going to be accepted. There was this conversation about whether or not the way information about you is processed should be transparent. So for example, if Google gets information about me, and the machine learning algorithm, it works with it and creates a profile of myself. I think the point was that you can't really explain it too efficiently, and that the machine learning algorithm is a good principle, but a black box. And I want to ask if there are any, is Google thinking about the ethical questions of that?
Yeah. So we certainly are thinking about things from a ethics perspective and kind of consumer protection standpoint, especially when you think about GDPR that's coming very quickly, and when you think about the implications for that. So Absolutely. We have advisory boards and things like that. So it's one of the top things that we think about. And I would kind of put that kind of lumped together with our overall security posture, that being at the forefront of just about every single thing we do.
So, hey, thank you so much. Thank you for coming. Give him a big applause.